All right, welcome. How you guys doing?
Packed house.
All right, this is Shop Talk. This is a function of the Ink Kitchen. Check it out, inkkitchen.com. It's all free information. We have articles for the last 5 or 6 years up there. It's all free. And then we have a YouTube channel, Ink Kitchen on the YouTube. Again, free information. All these talks will be up there. We have sponsors, Los Angeles Apparel, AlphaBroder, and you can read the rest. And I have with me here Lon Winters, my friend from Denver, Graphic Elephants, and we're going to talk about some of the most common issues in screen printing that cause people problems. And that would be curing, dye migration, and
registration, I think.
Registration. All right, which one do you want to do first? Let's hit dye migration.
That's my favorite.
All right, dude, what is dye migration?
I didn't know there was going to be a quiz.
Yeah, it's a quiz.
Dye migration is, I guess, in the short version, typically, not always, I suppose, but typically we get dye migration when the dyes in an unstable, not necessarily unstable, but a polyester or man-made fabric or threads or yarn release or become unstable at a certain temperature, which sometimes is below our ink cure temperature. So in a nutshell, we may find dye migration, the red peeking through the white ink, turning our white ink pink.
And the horrible thing about it is that you can print the shirt nicely, nice white ink on a red shirt, looks beautiful, comes down the dryer, throw it in the box, customer brings it back, calls you up, irate, ready to kill you because they didn't really order pink ink. So it could take a long time. In fact, I had some shirts on a shelf. It took a year to fully migrate. The white ink turned almost charcoal, but that process was a very slow one. So you can think you're fine, and then you're screwed. So it's really like a big problem. Once in a while you'll see it right away, but normally it takes time. So it's too late to do something about it after it happens. So what do you do about it? How do you stop this?
Well, the magic isn't much more complicated than simple math. Ideally, what we need to do is get our ink cured at a lower temperature than the dyes become unstable. And it's kind of a cross sometimes. What our traditional plastisol inks need to reach 3¼ 340, and sometimes that temperature is too hot for unstable dyes to release. So we'll never get them cured if the dyes are releasing at 310, and our ink needs to be reached 325. We're in a no-win situation. So our only options become, and the manufacturers have gotten better at it. We've got lower cure inks in the 270, 280 range, which help us unless we're doing digital camo or...
All right, yeah, so what about the very worst? So these are called bleeders. So the bleeders, what about the worst bleeders? Digital camo, some of these like real technical fabrics and stuff. Then what do you do?
Pray.
And now, besides praying, what do you do?
There's some options. They're not all perfect. You can use blockers that are either black or gray, and gray blocker is really just white with black carbon in it. That, if you can kind of think of like a fish tank filter, it's sort of filtering and holding down the dyes. And that's useful and helpful both in high solids water base as well as plastisol. And probably the best solution for us on as long as the fabric is smooth is a silicone solution. Silicone is porous, so honestly, and I've seen it happen, I didn't believe it when my friend Dan Solomon told me that it's porous, so the migration, the gas actually goes through and it'll look pink maybe at the end of the dryer, and over time it can actually go through and turn back to white. And I said, nah, that's bullshit, no way. And I watched it happen on digital camo. So the problem with silicone though is it coats everything because it's a coating. So if you've got fuzzy fabrics, or people are brushing polyester to make it feel more like cotton, if you look at it under a loop, it looks like we're printing on a cat. So when it's really furry or fuzzy, silicone's not a great option.
Right. So there's actually different grades of those gray blockers. So
Sure.
I know at least Rutland, and we use Rutland ink. I forget the different names, but one's kind of printable and stops most dye migration. One is like concrete and stops almost all, and then there's a black which stops all dye migration pretty much.
Of course, it's impossible to print.
Yeah, it's very hard to print, so it's limited what you can do with it. It's kind of counterintuitive that you print black to get a good white, but that's what you do. So can't we just print really thick white? Wouldn't that work? This is a leading question.
That sounds like experience to me. But
No, I think that people are just starting out. I mean, intuitively, you think, all right, if the red of the shirt is going to come through, if I print really thick white, it will stop it, right?
Sure.
But we want to get into how that works out.
Well, and we've done this just by experience many, many years ago. It doesn't matter how many times you print flash, the bleed is still going to come through. In fact, it probably gets worse because we're heating the garment many more times and getting a lot hotter.
Right, if you have a very thick ink, you're going to have to heat it for longer and hotter, and so it actually makes the dye migration worse, and it takes longer. So you think that you're fine, it looks a nice bright white, and your customer a week later is going to kill you. So, and you're going to eat that product almost always. And, this happens most or it's most obvious. So if you have blue bleeding through white, sometimes.
It's less obnoxious,
Yeah,
sure. Yeah,
but the burgundies and the reds that are unstable with the poly content, especially, I don't know, it seems like recycled is sometimes worse. I don't know if it's true. And it's really going to be noticeable. So you really got to be careful, and those inks are going to be your lifesaver. So sometimes you can test for them, like print a shirt. Well, there's a couple ways. One is you can print a shirt, leave it on top of your dryer or some warm place for a day, see what happens. That'll speed it up. Another is to do a dye migration test. And if you go to inkkitchen.com, we have that, how you do it. You want to explain how it's done, do a dye migration test?
I suggest you go to Ink Kitchen and read the article.
Anyway, plastisol is made from a plasticizer and a resin. So the plasticizer is uncurable reducer. I don't know, different ink companies have different names. It's only the half of the ink. You take a dot of that in an eyedropper, put it on, and heat press it with a piece of white fabric, and it will show you how much the dye is going to migrate. And it's a good shorthand when you've never dealt with the fabric. So you got a maroon shirt like this dude here, and you're like going to print it. It'd save your life sometimes to do that test ahead of time and see how serious a dye blocker situation you're going to need to get into.
Sure, and you're once you know whether you're going to have to wrestle that black blocker versus a gray blocker, and
or sometimes even just a poly white will work if you just see a little bit of dye coming through.
So you're going to end up with a combination of a lot of what we talked about here. We have multiple. Well, we have the black and the gray straight out of the bucket, but we also have the gray mixed with poly white 50-50 and the gray mixed with poly white 75-25. And it really depends on how bad it bleeds and how big your press is. Because if we have to run the black, then we've got to print that and flash it. Now we got to turn it white. So we might have to print a poly white, and flash it, and then our colors, and then probably a highlight white at the end. So really, to get our white, we're running 3 screens and minimum of 2 flashes to get that. So,
And so you're going to be really sore if you're manually printing it, and you're going to be really poor because you need a giant press otherwise, or you're going to do really simple designs at least. So usually we finish these talks and they have questions. I'm going to go, any questions about dye migration? Let's just start with that. Any of you have questions about dye migration?
Looks like we've covered it all.
All right, hearing none, we'll move on here. So what else, what do we got here? Registration.
Registration.
All right, so kind of why I thought of this was on Facebook, which is a horrible place for information usually. I saw somebody ask, like, why is my print out of registration? And I just saw, like, a lot of really bad answers. But there's a lot of potential causes for it. So if you went into a shop and there was a registration issue, what are the things that you would look at that might be causing it?
If you think about our process, the on-press component piece of it anyway, there's a lot of simple math that we're working with here. We use an off-contact distance, which is the distance between the substrate and the bottom of the screen. And then we use pressure and angle and speed on our squeegee. There's a durometer, and those things are all mathematical terms, and that's because there's a little simple math going on here. The way the math works is our resistant force, the tension of the screen, dictates how much off contact that we need and how much pressure that we need. We kind of react to that. So if our tension on one screen is different than a tension on another screen, then the math might be different. So our off contact distance might be greater or shorter on one screen than the other, and then our pressures would change. And then by definition, top to bottom registration would never line up mathematically. Now sometimes you get away with figure out how to dial it in and make it work, but first thing I look at if it's top and bottom registration is maybe we have an off contact tension and pressure issue one way or the other, inconsistencies.
Yeah, I think that the most common is the screen tension, because also, especially when you're using thick inks, because usually the registration problem that you see is that the white underprint is showing. And then you look and see if it's all on one side, then it's just out of register and you ought to dial it in. If it's in different places, a lot of times it's the screen tension, and that thick white ink will drag the mesh and be pulling it, especially if you see a variable, like one print's more out of register than another. Sure. It probably has to do with you maybe have the same pressure or a little bit different pressure is going to pull that loose mesh differently, right?
Absolutely. It's Rick's done this for different companies than I've done it for, but we've done a lot of on-site demo printing at trade shows like these, and you learn real quick what we call them compensation methods, where we'll do chokes and gutters and spreads and gaps and all kinds of things to make what we're doing on press look like magic. And those things that we do and learn, because we have to make it look like it's easy breezy, you apply in production. It's amazing how much better your registration gets if you start using those kinds of methods internally, where we'll make the underbase just slightly smaller than the overprint. And then that gives us just a little bit of overlap so we don't get the side-to-side registration issues, because you'll be on press and you get little white peeking on the left side, so you throw your hip into the screen or get the hammer out or you micro register it in, but now the little white line's on the right side. You chase it back and forth and back and forth. And what we're getting on that white, we're dragging it more because it's thicker, but we're also probably expanding a little bit in gain on that white. So we're back to math a little bit here, and it's probably getting bigger than our overprint colors. So we compensate for that, and we work a lot on the base to make it maybe a little smaller or create gutters and spaces for the other inks to go to minimize smearing, maximize wet on wet printing, and really has helped a ton when you get to, especially on a manual. It's real hard to keep everything on a manual really dialed in, especially at the end of the day versus the beginning of the day, those kinds of things.
And then the other basics that for registration, one is that check your films or check the registration of your direct-to-screen unit, and sometimes people forget to start with the basics.
Sure.
Like if your films aren't in register, you're lost. You know, you're not going to be able to do anything with that. And then I think level also. If your screens are warped or your palettes aren't level, you're also going to have registration issues. And I don't think that's necessarily intuitive at first, that you're going to have a registration problem from that, but you will.
Absolutely.
I don't know, did I miss anything here? Too much pressure, I think, also can, if not cause registration, will aggravate it and make it worse. Too hard of a squeegee, too soft of a squeegee, either way.
Pallets way out of whack. If your pallets aren't in plane, you can get registration on one pallet, and then the next pallet doesn't register. Maybe it's tilted or way out of plane from the previous.
Basically, you want everything lined up before you ever started printing. You want your films right, you want your platens level, you want your screens not warped and shot properly with good tension, and then you're not going to have a problem. Because once it's on press and you haven't done those basics, you are going to have hell to pay. And there's only so many tricks that are going to get you out of that.
Well, the film not registering is more common than you might think. We know this because we had to print 1,000 sets of the same film. We did a kit with 5 films that we provided, and it's amazing how far out of register they can get, trying to get 5 to line up with each other and then finding 5 of them. You don't realize it, but if you don't check that, there's the way the rolls work and the way the output works. That's why when you lose a piece of film and you need to re-output that one color, you pretty much need to re-output the whole thing, because the one color likely won't line up with the previous 5.
Very few film systems will allow for you to nest the films at different angles.
Good point.
Like if they're not, you want the films to come out, like it's nice to save film, but a lot of times because of the way the film has a tension on it, they'll be off if you have one this way and one this way. And then, like Lon said, if you do them at different times on the roll, that will also not be right. So what you have to do, what he said, which is rerun all the films on, say, a 6 color, because if you just try to replace that one, it won't line up with the others. The fun of screen printing. No wonder everybody's buying DTF machines, right?
Exactly. And films with a lot of toner stretch further than films without. So if you've got a little piece that's on the top and then on the bottom, and then a big black fill all the way around everything, really hard to line this piece and this piece up with that big amount of toner because it's stretching at a different rate. So just it's kind of back to basics.
There's some film systems that are, what are those called? The ones with like a fax machine, the thermographic.
I think that's right.
If you have thermographic film, God help you, because they try to compensate for the fact that it heats up the film and stretches it by slowing it up or speeding it up, and it's a very crazy system, and I don't recommend those systems. They used to be selling them all over the floor here. I don't know if they still are, but I would try to avoid that. There's my tip on registration.
Indeed.
Don't use a thermographic film situation. I'll probably get some hate mail on this one. Actually, any questions about registration? Hold on, we're going to get you a microphone. You have a beautiful voice, and we want it to carry throughout the hall.
Thank you. Does different shirt materials, do you have compensation methods for different shirt materials like poly blends, 100% cotton, on making sure they don't move on the platen any differently?
Oh, yeah, actually, that you bring up a very good point. Actually, I had a consulting gig that was a very large place in Europe, and one of the big problems was registration. It was the adhesive. They were using really crappy adhesive, but that kind of gets into that.
Sure, you have to do some experimenting with adhesives, because especially if you're running water, You need a different adhesive than you're running plastisol. Silicone, same. But then the fabrics. We're printing over in GSG's booth, and they brought a bunch. I think Gildan is their sponsor, and they brought a bunch of 64,000s and a bunch of hammer tees. And the 64,000s must have a silicone wash or something on them because the adhesive doesn't last near as long as it does on the hammer tees. The hammer tees I can run all day. The 64,000s I had to pretty much every couple hundred shirts reapply adhesive.
Yeah, I would say for registration of different types of material, there are certain really thin ones. We don't see it as much. We have a really good flash cure units, I would say, but you want to flash like a lower temperature and either a higher distance or a longer time, because certain fabrics actually, when you heat them up, will shrink, and that will cause a registration problem. And you know, there's not one answer. It depends. Like, printing is a system, and so like, we don't have to compensate for that with the type of honeycomb palettes we have on an MHM and the type of flashes, but other people like pre-flash the garment to like pre-shrink it, but then you have to keep moving. It's like a very complicated dance with some of those fabrics, and then you have to find an adhesive that works for you. We have a roll-on adhesive, both because we don't like to spray and because it works better on some of those. But that's a very good question, and it's a very complicated answer, I would say. Did that help? There's no really like one answer, I'll say that. If someone says, well, I just whatever, that won't necessarily work for you depending on the press and flash that you have and the type of adhesive that you use. So it's a balance of all of those things to get something like that printed, I would say. Any other questions about registration or about printing or about life in general?
What is the meaning?
It's not screen printing, I know that. All right, what was our other topic that we said we would cover?
I think you said cure.
Cure, okay. So one of my friends worked for Ink Company, and he would tour the country helping people out that would allow help, or the ones that were not beyond help. And he estimated actually that a very high percentage, like maybe over 50% of the garments he saw printed in this country were not fully cured. I don't actually buy other people's prints, so I don't see that much, but you do see people walking around with a lot of ink that's partly washed off. So I think it might be true. So let's talk a little bit about cure and how you figure it out. So you run it through the dryer, and if it's good, you touch it, it's good, right?
If you touch it and it's dry, it's good. No,
Actually,
there's some method to that magic. There's a number of tools that you can buy. Some are expensive and some are not so expensive. Ultimately, if you have a dealer or a manufacturer willing to do so, they typically will own those tools, and they can come in and help plot your dryer. So if you're running all standard cure plastisols, you must reach 325 degrees. Plastisol, we don't have to for a period of time, X, Y, Z. But for water-based, you have to reach a certain temperature for a period of time. Silicone's 250. The different inks have different parameters that are required, so you're going to have multiple settings. It's not a set it and forget it type of approach. And think about it too, a black shirt's going to absorb heat more than a white shirt. It's just the way science works as well. Polyester is going to absorb heat more than cotton's going to absorb heat. So you're going to have different settings.
black ink's going to absorb heat more than a reflective ink or a shimmer.
Exactly.
So it's a lot of complications. So, you know, I work a lot with the mills, and they'll say, well, or the distributors, they'll say, well, let's tell people what to set their dryer to cure ink on this particular shirt. I'm like, no. One person is in Maine, and it was 40 degrees all weekend, and it was raining for 6 weeks, and the truck that brought the shirts there drove through a driving rainstorm, and somebody else is in Arizona where it hasn't rained in the last century, and it's been 150 degrees in the shop until Monday morning. So no, you're not going to tell people what to set their dryer. You're going to have to figure out in your situation with the humidity in your shop, because water is going to come out of that shirt first and cool the shirt. So especially a canvas or something, it might, if it's wet, and I don't mean wet to the touch, I mean it came to you in a humid truck, it will not cure the same time this month and last month. It's a very difficult process, and the longer the dryer you have, the less you have to worry about it, because it's a function of time and temperature. And so the longer the time, the easier time you have with the temperature.
You've got a window. If you're in a longer dryer, you've got a window to reach those temperatures. If you're in a shorter dryer, you've got a real narrow space to hit the temperatures you've got to hit. So it becomes that much more critical. Even though it's a less expensive dryer, it takes up less square footage. It's the only thing that'll fit in my shop. You're going to be held, your feet are going to be held to the fire a lot more than a really big dryer where we've got a little bit more window to I guess, err on the side of caution, but you've got to hit those temperatures in a short window on a small dryer.
So actually our most observed in-kitchen post, I think, is about curing. And he mentioned some tools. There are temperature tapes. There's what's called a donut probe that will show you how your dryer's doing. There's a pyrometer, or a gun, people call it, that you can point at the shirt when it comes out of the dryer. Those are all great. Our best tool that we have is a notebook and a washer machine. You want to keep track of this, how you set things in a certain situation and whether it washes off or not. Because all those tools do not really get at what is going on at the bottom of the ink. You can't get there. So you need, if an ink cures at 320, it has to go all the way through. And none of those tools really get at what's at the bottom. You can extrapolate maybe when the outside's a certain temperature, getting to there, but you can't really in an absolute way tell, right?
There's kind of an old saying we use that you can't really tell if it's cured, but you can sure as shit tell if it's not.
No, and actually, it's really primitive, but another way is to just heat the hell out of the shirt until it scorches and turn it back a little bit. It's very big energy waster, but, that's one of the few ways you can tell. And then just don't try certain stuff. Don't try to do discharged ink on that little dryer there. It just won't work. There's not the airflow. So water-based inks are especially a challenging thing because the water has to evaporate before whatever else is in there cross-links. So that's where a long dryer really helps, or a very long time. And it's very tempting to turn the speed up of the belt, but it's, just physics. You can't make a miracle. You can't make it cure in a very short time in a short dryer. You can't turn it to like 700 degrees and hope in like a minute and 5 feet it's going to dry. It's not, try baking a cake like that,
Yeah.
800 degrees for 5 minutes instead of 350 for an hour. I don't think it's going to work.
There's some easy things you can teach the catcher or the QC person at the end of the dryer. Again, we can't really tell if it's cured, but we can probably tell if it's not. The pull test, if it after it's cooled, if you pull
after it's cool, no doubt.
Key. If you pull it and it breaks, the ink itself breaks on a standard type of stretch, 18 singles type of t-shirt material. And if it breaks, it's probably undercured. And then a crock test, if you basically dry, again, after it's cool, if you rub the ink on a white part of the shirt or another shirt and it comes off, you're probably undercured. And those
Although do not freak out the first time you do it. Almost always inks will crock a little. You'll get to find out if that's an acceptable amount. So same with that dye migration test I said. A lot of times you'll see a little dye come through. You need to do this test enough, or the crock test, enough to see what's acceptable and what's going to cause a problem, right?
it is a good indicator for somebody to go, hey, something's wrong here, and we're not boxing 2,000 shirts and shipping them when somebody knew they were cracking. So, or crocking excessively more than normal.
Right. Any questions about curing? We want to hear your beautiful voice.
I didn't hear the whole show, but what about difference between gas dryer and electric? Do y'all have any?
Yeah, we didn't get into that actually. We're not going to. No, we are. No, we are. No, we are. So, in general, gas dryers are more efficient. It depends where you are. I know, like, if you were in the Buffalo area for a while, electricity was like free, basically, because they have Niagara Falls there. And but in general, gas is more efficient if you have it in that area. I couldn't tell you about propane, actually. I think it varies. But in general, they tend to have more airflow in general, not necessarily. So water-based sinks usually do better with a gas dryer. We did mention earlier the length of the dryer really matters. And I know a lot of people are cramped for space, but you really want to get the longest dryer that you can, because that will make the easiest time of it, particularly for discharge or water-based, but really any ink. There's a much wider temperature that will be acceptable in a long tunnel than in a short tunnel. And it doesn't even cause a lot of heat. So we actually, this is kind of an aside, but it is related a little. We actually put 2 Ray Paul dryers together, 2 gas ones. And we thought we would have to run both burners, but we did not actually. We, just being in the heat longer was enough to really be very, very effective. So I really kind of saw firsthand that the length of the dryer makes a huge difference. I'll give a plug for it because I don't care. We have a Tasoma dryer. It's sold by SPSI. It is the most amazing dryer I've ever seen. I am just blown away. It's like super efficient. Like the size of the vent is about a quarter of the size of the one we used to have, and it was pretty good. And the gas pipe going in is half the size. And the money we save, and you touch the outside, it's not even hot. Like super, super efficient. Has all this variation you can do. We don't use any variation. We keep testing. Everything we throw through it is cured. But, and then we're not talking about DTG really, but we have a dryer for DTG, a Cavazuti. What a difference that makes over heat press, you know? Like you don't get the marks on it and stuff. Anything else to say about gas and electric?
You pretty much hit it, but big water-based printers are usually running a gas dryer. There are ways to cure water-based in smallish electric dryers with some airflow, but like Rick mentioned earlier, with water, you got to drive the water out first before you can get the cross-linking started and the cure started. So depending on, like with discharge, we're driving water into the fabric, so we've got to get water out, more water out than we might with HSA or some other water-based approaches. But typically speaking, you can do a lot with an electric dryer, but you can do a lot more with a gas dryer and a big tunnel.
One other thing I say, I used to have an electric dryer that you would indicate if like you had the lead burned out and the heat panel wasn't working, but right before it burns out, it would go haywire and either like be too hot or too cold, and that's where that donut probe, like what's going on either on side to side and also as the donut goes through, is really important to note that we would have to replace the leads that go to it sooner than it would indicate by just looking at the lights. You really got to monitor that on an electric dryer, I would say. And then if you do that kind of repair on your own, just make sure like if it's not super tight, it will burn out faster. You got to use the right connectors, the right wires, and you have to have it super, super tight. Any looseness of that will cause it to burn out faster. Other questions about curing? Or, yeah.
I have one. I don't know if it's about curing or dye migration, but what can you tell me about ghosting?
Ghosting. Actually, I have a really good article on InKitchen about it that goes more deeply into it. But that's a really interesting question. So for anybody that doesn't know what ghosting is, it should scare the shit out of you because you think you're doing the right thing. So you're printing, you're piling up the shirts at the at the end of the dryer, and then you look later. So my company is called Mirror Image. So I think about this often. You basically get a mirror image of the print on the back of the shirt, and you're, where did this come from? And what happens is, either from overheating, certain kinds of shirts, greens, certain greens and blues,
Charcoal.
and charcoal, and certain inks have like a blowing agent in it, and at a certain temperature, gas will continue to come out after through the dryer and go from the print into the shirt above it. And you can print a lot of shirts before you notice it because it's usually faint. So what do you do, my friend? There's actually a worse kind too, to really scare the hell. Some of the ghosting happens in the dryer, in a really thin shirt. That's even a bigger nightmare with I'm not going to answer that here because that's very probably specific to your own situation. But what do you do in a normal case of ghosting?
We became familiar with that term many years ago with some peroxides that are in some of the white inks. I don't know if they
Peroxide, yeah.
do anymore. But
Oh yeah, no, some
yeah.
have peroxides, and some of the blowing agents that help stop the dye migration we're talking about cause ghosting.
Cause ghosting. So, I mean, getting your dryer and your cure temperatures dialed in helps, and then ultimately, in a lot of cases, we've got a stage to get the shirts cool before we stack them. So we get the tables out and get everything, and ultimately, before they once they're cooled, we can restack them. But while they're hot, whatever is happening chemically or with the gases is happening because of that heat. We were just doing a benchmarking job for Wilflex recently, and it was almost like we were doing cotton shirts, but it looked like we did a cotton white on poly shirts. So there was something happening through the, it's not specifically ghosting, I don't think, at this stage, but a lot can happen in that hot stack. So
so multiple stacks and fans are like effective in a lot of the cases actually. Anything that will cool the shirt down. You know, again, when the short dryer, sometimes it's really hot temperature coming out and you can't stack the shirts when they're that hot. If you have to wear gloves to get the shirt, you're really at risk in particular. And with certain inks and certain colors, like I mentioned, especially, I don't know what, a couple of greens and blues and the charcoal that you mentioned are a big problem. And then the other thing you can do is they actually make non-ghosting white. So that would be the solution probably in that case where it's going from the front to the back of the shirt, would be to use a non-ghosting white. I know Rutland makes one.
probably not peroxide in that one.
No, there is no peroxide in that one. That's a really good question. And that's a really scary thing when it happens and you're like, well, how the hell did this happen? It's really mysterious if somebody hasn't told you about it. Great question. Any other question? Did that answer the question?
Yes.
All right. Any other questions? About printing really in general. I don't know what Lon charges, but it's a lot more than you're paying today. And so you got an expert here who has traveled the world, as have I, and ask away. Anything about printing you want.
Yeah, can you give us some tips on curing puff? I know every ink manufacturer has their own, but what has worked for you guys?
All right, curing puff.
Curing puff. We were doing puff. I got my start in this business printing for OP. That's how old I am.
Yeah, it's so old that no one even knows what that is anymore. Go ahead.
They used to be the 800-pound gorilla in the late 80s, mid 80s. So we did early puff, or early-ish puff. We had this printer, I think it was a Vietnamese guy, no speaky, but he would, we did a lot of puff because we had a children's wear license at that time. And whenever we couldn't get it to come up in the dryer, he'd say, no pop, no pop,
No pop.
no pop. So ultimately, we learned a few things about puff. The idea behind puff is you print it through a coarse-ish mesh, and when it goes through the dryer, it blows. It blows up and it blows out. So a beautiful thin line of puff usually works really nice, but a big old wide area, you've got highs and lows within that, and even a thin line, you got a low spot and a high spot, low spot and high spot. And what we've kind of done, we call it another compensation method. We might put a half-tone white under it or a mezzotint white under it so that we can kind of keep it up. You have to have space for it. You can't really put it directly on top of a white printer or base because then it won't blow. So kind of coming up with some compensation methods to get a full-blown puff. And there's different brands with probably higher or lower quality. There's
I recommend the new puff. I think that's
New Puffs,
Wilflex. That's a
Wilflex,
really
yeah.
good puff. They don't make all colors of it though.
It seems like the white's great, but as soon as you want to go to colors, it's a little bit more difficult. Manufacturers will make a additive, which I don't care for per se, versus a base.
Yeah.
Like New Puff is more of a base because it's built to do one thing. It's built to be a puff.
Agreed.
So there's a little bit of trick to it, and then the design work and how you use it. You just don't want big areas of it because it's really hard to get the whole thing to come up.
It's like a cake, you know. It's going to expand out and up, and just like a cake, if you overcook a cake, so a big area, it'll collapse in the middle, like a cake can collapse in the middle. And so a lot of it's the art. And also, either you won't see it or it just doesn't have enough material there to puff. So like he mentioned, the thin lines. So it starts with the art. Don't make a big giant area, don't make a really thin line. So that's one of the biggest things. And then you have to heat. There's where a good dryer again, you know, because if you overheat it, it will collapse or flatten out, and if you underdo it, it won't blow.
Getting them really flat on the dryer is really important because if you've got wrinkles in it, you're going to get highs and lows within it. So the window on puff is to get it ideal.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Is really, it's narrow, so you don't want to have any highs and lows in that area. So get it as flat as you can on the belt. That will help.
I forgot about that one. Thank you.
There you go. Check one off.
Yeah, well, we do it, and we were having trouble the other day, and I didn't tell them that. So that's a good one. It's not easy either. But you know what? That's a good thing to know. It's not that easy. It's not a magical ink. It's a little bit tricky. And so if you're not having trouble with it, don't feel bad about yourself because it'll take some experimentation with your particular setup and way of printing. And then he did mention, I'll reiterate, make sure you get enough down. So you got to use a low enough mesh to get plenty of the material down.
We'll add a little stencil too now that we're with the big craze that we lived through with all the textures and the high densities and those kinds of things. And we went, hey, I'll bet my puff would be better if I had a thicker stencil. So we'll add a little bit of stencil, not so much as a 100, 200, 400 micron stencil, but maybe up to
Extra
100
coat on the
micron.
screen or something, yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions about printing in general? That was a good question. Thank you. Other printing questions?
All right.
All right. Hearing none. We're done.
We're done.
All right. How about a hand for Lon Winters here?
I usually start out by asking if my hair looks okay. I forgot.
Thanks for coming. Check out In Kitchen's YouTube channel. This will be up there eventually. Check out our articles about dye migration and ghosting. I think those are some of our better articles and about curing. Check those out and check out our sponsors. They make it all free.